So, young Spinoza was offered an annual stipend of 1,000 florins if he would be silent upon his convictions and from time to time show himself at the synagogue. This he refused with high-minded scorn. He was ready to earn his bread by polishing lenses or optical instruments. Upon this he was excommunicated, a proceeding which is thus described. Remember, von Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope there in Holland, I guess, where Spinoza was, so maybe work in his shop, polishing lenses for honest income. Anyway, here's a description of the excommunication of Spinoza. Quote, "The day of excommunication at length arrived, and a vast concourse assembled to witness the awful ceremony. It began by the silent and solemn lighting of a quantity of black wax candles, and by opening the tabernacle wherein is deposited the books of the law of Moses. Thus were the imaginations of the faithful prepared for all the horror of the scene. The chief rabbi, the ancient friend and master, now the fiercest enemy of the condemned, was to order the execution. He stood there pained, but implacable. The people fixed their eyes upon him. High above, the chanter rose and chanted forth in loud, lugubrious tones the words of execration, while from the opposite side another mingled with these curses the thrilling sounds of the trumpet. And now the black candles were reversed and were made to melt, drop by drop, into a huge tub filled with blood." So the light going out, being drowned, I guess. "Then came the final anathema. Quote, with the judgment of the angels and of the saints, we excommunicate, cut off, curse, and anathematize Baruch de Spinoza, with the consent of the elders and all this holy congregation, in the presence of the holy books, by the 613 precepts which are written therein, with the anathema wherewith Joshua curses Jericho, with the curse Elisha laid upon the children, and with all the curses which are written in the law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he in sleeping, and cursed be he in waking. Cursed in going out, and cursed in coming in. The Lord shall not pardon him. The wrath and the fury of the Lord shall henceforth be kindled against this man, and shall lay upon him all the curses written in the book of the law. The Lord shall destroy his name under the sun, and cut him off for his undoing from all the tribes of Israel, with all the curses of the firmament which are written in the law. And we warn you that none may speak with him by word of mouth, nor by writing, nor show any favor unto him, nor be under one roof with him, nor come within 4 cubits of him, nor read any paper composed by him."
It's in a book.
Read your books!
All right. Welcome to the next episode of RYB. We're not going to cover all of ethics today. We're just going to do part 1, which talks about Spinoza's metaphysics, but his metaphysics are sort of his most novel and sort of popular idea anyways. So that's what we'll be talking about. Well, I think we'll get back to the rest of the book later on. My guest here, Mo, has some obligations he must meet, and therefore can't really give the book a full analysis, a full justice. And it's very dense. It's pretty difficult to read. Pretty technical.
I'll try to get to it, though.
Yeah.
Try to get to it.
So we'll eventually come back and do like the other 4 parts of the ethics. But today we'll just talk about the first part of the ethics, where Spinoza talks about his version of God. And after reading it, I got to say, what the fuck? I believe in God now. Now hold your horses. You might say, wow, Jeff, you've finally put your fedora up. But unfortunately, as many people reading Spinoza in the 17th century found, his definition of God is quite a bit different and somewhat infuriating to theists. So don't worry, we'll get to that. That's basically what we'll be doing today, is going through all of his proofs and descriptions for his naturalistic sort of view on creation. And he was very popular among various intellectuals. If I recall, Einstein was sort of a Spinozist in terms of his metaphysics. Anyways, there's also a essay in the description that I put down there that we're reading in addition to the first part of ethics, and it goes over some of the technical details. I would recommend reading it after you read ethics, otherwise it'd be kind of a word salad. And this is kind of really dense technical stuff, and so if you're really into the question, if you really want to like square away your thoughts. Don't take my word for it. Just go read him and see if it compares to like your beliefs and stuff. Like I'm just gonna
study guide along with it too.
And try to find like a study guide and other things if you need it. But we're just gonna talk about our impressions, like what I thought about while reading through his sort of proofs for things and sort of the implications of his metaphysics. And but yeah, don't take my word for it. If you're like, oh well, Jeff, you're wrong because X, Y, Z. Well, I just read Spinoza once and took some cursory notes and read like one article that helps explain him a bit. So I'm no scholar, and so if you really want to challenge the ideas of Spinoza, just go read him and then do it yourself. Don't take my word for it. But with that in mind, let's get down into it.
Down and dirty.
Down and dirty. So yeah, so he very the book is laid out in a very sort of academic way. Although it's like 1700s, it's very clear. So he has his definition, so he writes down what he means by certain words that are sort of central to his argument. He has axioms, which are sort of assumptions that he is using as true when he's making his arguments. And then he has propositions, which are sort of follow from the definitions and axioms that then explain his sort of ultimate explanation about metaphysics. All right, so let's get into the definitions.
Each proposition then have their own demonstration and
yes.
What is it called? Scholarium? I've never.
I don't know what the word for it is, but yeah. So he writes a proposition, and then he writes an additional argumentative a thing under it with various notes and expansions on why it's true and such. And then he sort of just goes through that for how many? I don't remember exactly, but let me look.
30 something in the first part.
Yeah, 36. He has 36 propositions in part one.
And a large appendix at the end too.
And an appendix which some of his famous shit talking quotes are from, where he's like shit talking like theologians of his time and the Jews and Christians and all. He's just basically throwing shade at everybody. It's pretty funny. And that's probably another reason why he got excommunicated. If you heard the intro,
and his books was in the Catholics archive of forbidden books too.
Yeah, but basically despite Spinoza basically arguing for the most powerful God possible. That's basically what he argues for. Is the
ultimately powerful God.
the truest as you can, the closest as you can get to like all powerful is what he argues for. And what it basically does, if once you argue that way, it kind of destroys most modern conceptions of theology. And then everyone started calling him an atheist, like all the Jews and the Catholics of his time, like called him, oh well, you're causing atheism, Spinoza. So he basically used the same concepts to epically BTFO theism, which is funny. Although I guess you could call him a pantheist or a I don't know. I guess pantheist is the best description.
Yeah, exactly.
And we'll get into why that is. And don't worry, when I say pantheist, I don't mean like in like the goofy modern way. It's very sort of technical how he arrives at that conclusion, and we'll talk about that. All right.
It's more from the fact that in his worldview, a god is necessary for everything to be, and so
there has to be a god. And really, you can replace his word God with like a number of things. Like you say, oh well, nature or the universe, and everything still makes sense. He used the word God to sort of be incendiary and sort of argue against theology because it sort of there's a bit of overlap. And I would say most
substance. By his own word usage is kind of the closest to a replacement.
And so, as most theists say, he's like, well, that definition of God's clearly wrong. But whatever, we'll get into it. All right, so the first definition he says is, by that which is self-caused, I mean that of which the essence involves existence, or that of which the nature is only conceivable as existent. So with this, he's saying that since something exists, there necessarily must be like an original cause. There must be something that caused itself for existence to follow from it. And I guess we'll talk about the implications after I get through all the definitions. All right, so definition 2, he talks about a thing is called finite after its kind when it can be limited by another thing of the same nature. So for instance, a body is called finite because we always conceive another greater body. So also, a thought is limited by another thought, but a body is not limited by thought, nor a thought by body. So this is sort of a distinction between like finite and infinite things. So finite fundamentally is things that are limited in some way. And when I was reading this, I thought, okay, so well, one implication of this is that if your infinite entity is making a choice, then it's technically limiting itself, and it can be there could be a more infinite entity that does everything, that sort of that controls that makes that into a subset. And then Spinoza actually agrees with this and talks about it later. All right, so definitions 3 through 5 are substance, attribute, and mode. So the most important one is substance, where he talks about by substance I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. In other words, that of which a conception can be formed independently of other conception. So by substance he means the original entity. So if you think, all right, so here imagine there's nothingness, and there has to be some entity that creates itself. And you might say, oh, well, that's kind of ridiculous. But how else does the container for everything that exists happen? Like how you can say, oh, well, the container just always existed. Well, that doesn't really make any sense. There has to be some sort of meta layer. There has to be something that willed itself into existence. And then Spinoza additionally,
there would be no existence.
Yeah. So there's an original thing that self creates. And for that thing that self creates to be for sure 100% the thing that self creates, there can't be it has to contain everything. It has to be truly infinite. It has to.
Yeah, it can't be created by other things.
Yeah, it can't.
So there's only one.
There's only one thing, and it like the original thing obviously can't have a pre-original thing. Otherwise, it would be like onion layers of reality. Like, let's say, just a simplification, like, oh, we're living in a snowflake, in a giant's eye, in a computer simulation, in a dream, and etc. Just keep layering it up, but eventually you'd have to explain, okay, so but then why is the giant there dreaming? How did he get there? And so on. It just keeps going. You say, oh, well, there's never any end to this. But Spinoza sort of devises an end to that, which is really cool. And so basically, to end this layer of like, oh, how can we ever know like what layer of metaphysics we're on? Well, eventually there's something that self-creates, and that thing contains everything. So for something to follow from that, for something to exist, there has to be something that is truly infinite, that contains all things possible, all knowledge, and all possible actions. So Spinoza calls this God. And true enough, I would say it's pretty close to something that you could call a god. Anyways, after describing substance, which is sort of the originality thing, he describes attributes and modes, which, I mean, they're not that important. They're just sort of describing, okay, so there's differences in things. That's basically all it's saying.
Modes is the big topic, though, especially of the freaking
the paper. Well, I mean, yeah, but I mean, it's basically just a word describing that there are differences between things,
right?
And that is sort of important when you're talking about metaphysics. All right, so then here's probably his most contentious definition. So he says, by God, I mean a being absolutely infinite, that is, a substance consisting in infinite attributes, of which each expresses eternal and infinite essentiality. Explanation, I say absolute infinity, not infinite after its kind. For a thing infinite only after its kind, infinite attributes may be denied. But that which is absolutely infinite contains in its essence whatever expresses reality and involves no negation. So the true for him, God has to include everything and be everything at once, or well, not even really be everything, but the original entity that forms the environment which all other things can happen in has to contain everything. Otherwise, they couldn't happen, right? Or they couldn't be conceived of. And that's really just the crux of where he argues from after this. And then definition 7, he talks about That thing is called free, which exists solely by the necessity of its own nature, and of which the action is determined by itself alone. On the other hand, that thing is necessary or rather constrained, which is determined by something external to itself. So now he argues that, all right, so we exist, and so if we exist, there must necessarily be something that it created itself and also has the possibility of everything within it. So then all the possibilities and us, we can all then exist afterwards. It's like the original cause, the first self-caused cause, if you will. And so when he talks about freedom, he says, okay, so this original thing is free. But then he talks about how it doesn't really have choice later, which sort of upsets a bunch of people as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's where he kind of destroys the modern.
Yeah, so by saying that his God, his infinite thing, doesn't have any choice or personality or sort of things like that, he sort of upsets all the theists. But really, if you think about it, like, how the hell can an infinite being, why would an infinite being choose? It would never choose. It doesn't have to, like, denigrate itself to choosing things or having feelings or like, goals. It just is everything.
Well, yeah, that's where he uses the word necessity. Like, everything that's been done has been done out of necessity. That's the point he argues.
All right, and the last definition, 8, he talks about eternity. So he says existence itself. Well, basically, he says there's a sort of eternity and eternal truth. Or the original substance must exist eternally. Otherwise, it wouldn't be infinite, right? Or if there, well, think about it this way. So, if the original substance,
I'm sorry, the fucking comment.
I know you have nothing to do, but I saw a discussion on my, this book seems to be like a huge fedora tip from the 1800s.
No, did this book start Gamergate?
Did this book start Gamergate? I don't know.
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Anyways,
I don't think anybody involved with Gamergate.
So his justification for eternity is that, all right, so if there is a time, if there was like a time environment in which the original self-creator then like popped up on a timeline, then he wouldn't be the original self-creator. He'd be contained in that sort of time environment. So necessarily, the self-created thing also must be eternal, because there can't be a time environment for him to exist in without himself creating it. So there must be this eternal, self-created, original entity from which all other causes and effects stem from which all the environment that anything can be happened of or conceived of stems from this original infinite entity. All right. So those were just the definitions. Oh, yeah. I know, right? One page. We're done with one page. On to the next page.
Now the axioms.
20 minutes in. One page done. All right. Axioms. Everything which exists either in itself or something else. So that's pretty simple. So if something exists, it's either contained within something or it itself exists. Yeah. And you can keep finding cause and effects and containers as you go up the onion layers. Like, this layer of time or this layer of reality and so on. And
the only thing that exists in itself is then the substance.
Yeah, so the only thing that truly exists in itself is the original infinite entity that reflects everything back into the environment.
Sky Daddy.
Sky Daddy, if you will. That which cannot be conceived through anything else must be conceived through itself. And so this is sort of saying that, okay, well, you can't really have something that conceives of this original entity. Otherwise, that would be the original entity. And so eventually it just stops, and there's the original entity that self-conceives. Axiom 3 is, from a given definite cause, an effect necessarily follows. And on the other hand, if no definite cause can be granted, it is impossible that an effect can follow. So this is basically saying that if you look at all the world, there's always a cause. There's always a cause behind everything, and that's true. Cause and effect is true, and that you can't say something happened if you can't narrow down the cause for sure. And so there's always a cause, and if you keep going back up the layers of causality, you eventually get to the point. Well, okay, so there must be a self-causing thing that contains everything in it. All right. So 4 is, the knowledge of effect depends on and involves the knowledge of a cause. And this is true enough, but you can I think this is arguable because you can't understand an effect of something. Like you can understand like something that affected something else in the environment without knowing exactly what caused it. Like you can actually understand every iota of what that effect was without knowing the cause. But you obviously only get full knowledge if you have the cause. Axiom 5 is things which have nothing in common cannot be understood, the one by the means of the other. The conception of one does not involve the conception of the other. So you can't really use independent ideas to explain each other if they're truly independent. And this is sort of trying to lay out a distinction between things. So if something is truly independent, then they can't explain each other. Number 6 is a true idea must correspond with its ideate or object. That is to say that for something
worded way different. A true idea must agree with its object, but yeah.
All right, so a true idea, it basically has to have a reality thing that corresponds to it that is distinct from other things. Otherwise, it's not a true idea. If it doesn't describe anything categorically, it's not true, which is sort of the point. Sort of how categorical reality works. If a thing can be conceived as non-existing, its essence does not involve existence. So this one's a bit confusing. So you might be thinking, okay, if a thing could be conceived as non-existing, its essence does not involve existence. Well, doesn't that argue that then nothing can exist? Because if you can conceive of everything not existing, we can all conceive of there being nothing. But what he means by this is that since we can conceive all of the sort of material world is non-existing, then it fundamentally does not like self-create, right? It doesn't. There's no like nothing making all the chairs and the tables and our people self-creating. They don't have that power within their attributes. But then the only thing that does then is the self-created original entity. Because you can't conceive that as not exist. Well, because we exist, we can't conceive as the original entity not existing. And that's sort of his argument around that. Okay, axioms and definitions done.
Almost done with page 2.
Alrighty. Yeah, maybe this might go on a bit longer than I thought. All right.
Well, we'll see how many of the propositions, because we're not going to go. I mean, if we go from proposition to proposition, then it'll take hours.
Yeah.
So we'll have.
Well, we'll skim over some of them. All right. Ugh. Substance is by nature prior to its modifications. So this is just basically saying that the original entity was not modified by anything. And that's really all it says. Proposition 2, two substances whose attributes are different have nothing in common. So basically, that if you have two entities that are sort of original, they cannot be like compared as being caused of each other. And then proposition 3, things which have nothing in common cannot be one the cause of the other, which is just restating basically what I just said. Proposition 4, two or more distinct things are distinguished one from the other either by the difference of the attributes of the substances or by the difference of their modifications. So this is basically saying things are different because they are different, because they have different attributes and substances. And then proposition 5, there cannot exist in the universe two or more substances having the exact same nature or attributes. So this makes sense. Basically, you can't have two things that are exactly the same. Like, even if you have like a carbon copy of yourself, let's like imagine you were cloned and there's someone standing right next to you. Well, they're standing right next to you. They can't actually be in the same exact spatial configuration that you are in, right? Like they
could be caused by the same thing either. They would have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's already sort of a modality in existence. Like you can't have something occupy an exact copy of yourself where you are. Like you can have an exact copy of yourself, but it's fundamentally different. Like the things are different from each other, and you can't have a copy of things. And so this is sort of I guess not the strongest argument for his original self-created thing, but that's one that he uses. All right, proposition 6. One substance cannot be produced by another substance. So this is just sort of getting into the definition of what he means by substance. Is that so for something to be
You can't, that nothing can create the substance, the one substance that there is.
Yeah.
It's
So,
that.
I mean, like, basically the word substance and God are interchangeable for Spinoza.
Yeah.
Like, they're basically the same thing.
Said.
And so once this original self-created entity that contains everything, like, sets itself out there, like all right, so the entity creates itself, and within that entity, it has infinite intellect, and it has infinite capability. And so within that infinite intellect, it knows every permutation of every possible every conceivable environment that infinite intellect can conceive, and it can actually create all of those environments. That's what truly being all powerful means, right? Like you have all the knowledge and the ability to act on all of it, and you also have acted on all of it. And this is a really important distinction we'll get to later. But if you can't say,
it ties into the second part of the book with the mind, about ideas, how ideas.
You cannot say that God has not done something, and this is kind of a very important distinction that really kind of breaks theology down, or traditional theology kind of blows it up. Is you cannot say that God has not done something, and that is to say that if he's truly omnipotent and knows everything, he's already done everything. You can't say, oh, well, he's just doing things this one way. No, he's already done everything. He knows everything, and he's doing everything in every permutation. Otherwise, he's not all powerful. He's not infinite. He's restrained. If a god is self-restraining himself, like he's saying, okay, so I'm going to restrain myself. I'm going to do this one thing in this one way. Then he gets eaten. He gets subsumed by this other god that Spinoza talks about. So like imagine that there's the traditional theistic, all-powerful God who creates the universe and then does things in this one way for this one goal. Well, there's a sort of more infinite God that's done everything for every goal in every way, every way possible. So basically, that God
could be done.
Yeah. So traditional gods become traditional gods become a subset of Spinoza's God, and you can't argue that they don't. Like basically, for the god to not be like nested in another god, they have to have done everything. They have to they not only do they have to know everything, they have to have done everything. And you can't say they haven't done everything, because that's restricting them. That's restricting the power of them. All right. Okay. So, where were we at? We were at Proposition 6. Proposition 7. Existence belongs to the nature of substance. This is kind of expanding on that. Let's see, lost the page.
And we are at Proposition 8. Every substance is necessarily infinite.
Yeah. So it's basically just restating the definition.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we don't need to go through all of these to detail, because he kind of just builds on his own definitions.
Yeah.
With the propositions.
So every substance is necessarily infinite, basically saying that for you to be sure, absolutely, completely, utterly sure, that the first self-created entity that created the environment that everything can happen in, it has to contain everything in it. Otherwise, you can't be sure. If it doesn't contain everything, if it restricts itself in any way, then there's always the possibility that it's actually on a lower onion layer, that it's actually being contained in something else.
How is your Proposition 8 worded? Because again, we don't have the same.
Every substance is necessarily infinite.
Oh yeah, so we have the exact same. Yeah, because this is the first when I read through it the first time. This is where I got kind of confused.
Yeah.
He saying every substance kind of brings about the idea of several substances, and already at this point, I kind of got that there's.
It's kind of a weird wording, but yeah, he later starts arguing. Okay, well, there's only one substance.
Exactly.
And he just argued that there's only one substance.
That's why I was so happy when I read the essay. It's like, yay, I didn't mess up.
Yeah, he argues for single modality, which the essay that I put in the description kind of talks about in sort of a more modern context. All right. So, let's see. Yeah, he writes a crap ton about Proposition 8. Let me see if I had any extra notes on that.
It does 3 parts on it, I can see here.
Alright, so the original substance must contain everything that exists and be unrestrained, otherwise it isn't the substance by definition. Basically, the original cause, so the original self-created thing that causes everything else, by its definition, must be unrestrained. If the onion layer keeps going, eventually there is some infinite original cause which has created itself. So if that original cause is restrained in any way, then there's a bit of a doubt. There's a doubt that there could be something even better or even bigger that sort of contains it within its like outer layer.
Right, and then it's not God because God is perfect.
Yeah. So if it doesn't contain everything and it hasn't done everything, then it's not perfect. It's not God, according to Spinoza. And then he says, there is a singular abstract concept that exists, no matter the number of existent entities. Which is kind of, I don't know. I think he was talking about like triangles or something. He's like saying, well, there's the abstract of the triangle, and that is like singular and like modally exists, no matter how many triangles you draw. But I think that's kind of an arbitrary distinction.
Triangle yet, but he does get into the geometry at some point. I had to Google some of the.
Well, no, this is mainly just him talking about like the abstract idea of things, and the common example, the one that Plato used to use, is like the triangle, and so that's what he uses. He says everything that is existent must have some sort of cause that formed the original environment for cause and effect to occur in. And I agree with this. For things that exist, there must be something that caused them, and you can keep, as I said, the onion layer model. You keep making another layer of reality, and eventually it hits an end. And Spinoza is describing this end, the end of all onions, like that there can be nothing more than this entity, that this entity is all encompassing. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. That's prop 8. Prop 9. The more reality or being a thing has, the greater the number of its attributes. People, they were talking about this one in the essay as being like stupid. But I think all he's really trying to say is that that you can keep counting up the number of attributes of something, and eventually you'll reach the infinity number of attributes, which is the substance.
Well, you won't get to the end because there's infinite amount of attributes, but the more attributes you put
so the most real thing is the infinite.
It becomes.
Yeah.
Right. But the more attributes something has, the more real it becomes, which, I mean, I like that part. That's one of the ones I had underlined. It was good.
All right, then he says, each particular attribute of the one substance must be conceived through itself. So that means, the self-created thing has to have everything in it. So it's not like so the self-created thing creates an environment, and then randomly, like, shit just starts happening in it. The self-created thing is an intellect and contains every possible permutation of every conceivable and inconceivable reality, and everything about existence and every possible existence. It has all of that within it. Otherwise, how could it exist?
Cause,
yeah.
And insofar things have a cause.
I think this is a pretty convincing argument. So, like, how can something exist if it didn't originally exist? Is sort of what he's saying. Right. And it's like, how can it? And and so it kind of makes sense. Like there's something that sort of nests all other environments within it, and that thing has to also contain everything that could be in those environments. Every thought, every object, every entity has to be contained within that first layer. Otherwise, they couldn't really exist within it. They'd be out of it. They'd be non-existent. And this is sort of the crux of his metaphysics. All right. That was prop 10.
Now, yeah, prop 8.
Prop 11.
11, yeah.
God or substance consisting of infinite attributes of which each expresses eternal and infinite essentiality necessarily exists. So here he is justifying his model of sorts, that this original substance that creates everything must necessarily exist. And he argues about it for a number of pages. Or maybe this is prop 11. It's prop 11.
God or substance consisting of infinite attributes.
Yeah.
Which of each expresses. Yeah, so it's basically the same thing.
And so this infinite entity that Spinoza describes does not assign itself attributes. It doesn't have a personality. It doesn't make choices. It doesn't restrain itself in any ways. It can't restrain itself because it's everything. And you might say, oh, well, if you say it can't restrain itself, then it's not God. You're limiting its power. Well, that's the exact opposite. If you say it restrain itself in any way, you're limiting its power. That's sort of what restrain means.
I got one line underlined in this proposition, which kind of sums it up for me at least, where he says, so either nothing exists or an absolute infinite being also exists.
Yeah. And that's sort of his sum up, is that we can't exist if there was not the original self-created entity that also contains everything. And that makes a lot of sense. Like how there's not really another way you can for sure describe the original cause of things. All right, prop 12 and 13. Let's see. Dang, he wrote a lot about prop 11.
Yeah, pretty long, yeah.
See. 11, 12. All right.
No
attribute
of substance. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
You can read. Hold on. Hold on a sec.
All right. I'll read it aloud. Okay. So no attribute of a substance can be truly conceived, from which it follows that the substance can be divided. And
yeah.
Yeah, you take that one again.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And this is where he's arguing for the singular modality. That once you imagine
if it can to be divided, yeah.
Once you imagine that this entity that self-created and then contains everything, you can't divide it. Otherwise, then it will be subsumed by another substance, or it will be contained within the substance. So, like my example earlier, like if you have the Christian God and he's doing one thing in one universe in one way, he becomes a subset of Spinoza's infinite God that has done everything in every way and will do everything in every way. And is everything. It doesn't make decisions, and it's just is everything. And so you can't divide it. You cannot say, oh, well, there's this infinite God, but he's made this decision. There's only infinite, and that's it. There's only every permutation, every existence. Otherwise, you cannot be sure that it isn't being contained within something else. All right, so then he says, substance is absolutely infinite, is indivisible. So basically just restating what he just said. 14, besides God, no substance can be granted or conceived. And so, basically, he is just restating definitions repeatedly.
It's only one God, get over it. And that's pretty much it.
Well, I mean, by his definition, yeah, it makes sense. There can only be one entity that contains everything. Otherwise, it wouldn't be considered a thing that is contained within everything, right? Otherwise, it doesn't exist. That's sort of what he's getting at. All right, prop 15.
15.
Whatsoever is in God and without God, nothing can be or conceived. So here he talks a bit about thoughts. So you might say, oh, well, thoughts are kind of different than existence. So he's like, no, the thoughts are also things that exist. And so they also must be included within this original entity. Otherwise, they couldn't exist. And so he says, if you can conceive of something, it's also included within this original entity. If you any combination of thoughts you have is included with this self-created entity. And let's see.
Yeah, I like the first part of the Scholarium here. There are those who feign a god, like a man, consisting of a body and a mind, and subject to passions. But how far they wander from the true knowledge of God is sufficiently established by what has already been demonstrated. Them I dismiss.
Just fucking tip. Yeah, so basically, because thoughts are a real thing... Oh, hold on.
I'm talking about God, Mom. Oh, fair enough. Well, I don't know where to go from that. Hold on. Let me see.
Yeah.
It was about thoughts.
Oh, all right. The so because thinking is a thing that we do, and we can conceive of other things, and those things must be included within this this self-created entity, then also that self-created entity must also be capable of thinking, which is pretty obvious. And sort of the implications of that is that entity also has all knowledge, in addition to having like everything being contained within it. Okay. Let's see.
Yeah, that's sort of a big cornerstone of the. I don't think that big, but still one of the cornerstones of the second part, which is ethics of the mind.
Yeah, and we're not going to cover that today, just because this book's super dense. Like we're only on page like 7, at least on my copy. It's already been like almost an hour.
Page 10, yeah, on mine. So it's. Oof.
All right, so he writes
I was so baffled when you said when you wrote Friday. Don't worry, I'll finish it by Sunday.
Yeah, I'm like, oh. I thought everything would be as like easy as part 1. Like part 1 is easy compared to the other parts.
Yeah,
which is rough.
Which is not even easy.
Yeah, part 1's really complex. All right,
and then it just keeps growing.
Okay. So what are we at? Proposition 16. From the necessity of the divine nature must follow an infinite number of things in infinite ways. That is, all things which can fall within the sphere of infinite intellect. So this is another one that got him in hot water. Is he says that for this its original self-created entity to continue forth, he must also have actually done everything else. Like as I sort of stated at the start. You can't say God hasn't done anything. And like in order for the omnipotence and the all-powerfulness to be all-encompassing, he must have done everything and will be doing everything. Which is to say every possible permutation of reality has been and will be done. It's like the implications of this is that this original self-created entity might be running. We might be in universe number whatever, and maybe the Greeks were completely right, and all those Greek demigods existed and were running around. Then they all died, and now we're just here. Like that. That's possible, and it's just a subset of Spinoza's sort of infinite first God. So basically, that's what we called him a pantheist. Is that according to this original substance, if something can be conceived of, then it must exist, because the original thing that created all existence can also conceive of it, and it's all powerful. Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah, exactly. You're putting a frame around everything that we've essentially thought of ever, and so insofar as it's been in the mind of a human being, it's been as a thing existing in the world. Question is whether or not it's been some sort of physical being or whatever the Greeks thought about their gods. But yeah, it makes sense.
So if you can imagine something existing, then by definition, the original self-creating entity will have or must have ran that simulation. It must have created that and had that exist at some point.
I remember him talking about nature too. It's something about ideas. Well, that might be part 2. And an idea is true if it is pertaining to the laws of nature. But yeah, I'm only vaguely remembering that now.
Yeah, but since we can conceive of like alternative laws of nature and alternative ways of things happening, then this is also included in this original entity's intellect. It's included in his being. And presumably also included in his being are the states of that conceivable reality existing and that conceivable reality not existing. So those are also included. And then what that means is that we're basically in an endless supermutation of every infinite permutation of things, and that we can never know where we are at it. So like any religion at any time could be right, and we just can't know. All right. Prop 17. God acts solely by the laws of his own nature and is not constrained by anyone. This is another sort of restatement of definitions. That the because the self-created entity at the end of every environment created itself and all the laws of nature and everything within it, then it's not being constrained. It doesn't really. It's not really that important.
Oh yeah, this is the really long one. I remember now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's sort of talking about God being his own free cause, and then arguing that
it's the God has to be perfect, or else it's not God.
Yeah. So this entity obviously can create itself, and then it can create things in the environment. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. If this entity was unable to create itself, and then also unable to, let's say this entity created itself, but it could only think, right? Then it wouldn't be. Then we wouldn't have an environment to live in, right?
Right.
It needs to be able to create things, and so it can, and so it has. You can't say it has not. Otherwise, you're restricting it. All right. What is this? Prop 19.
Oh, 18 first. We didn't do 18.
Yeah,
because this one kind of confused me a little bit.
God is indwelling.
Immanent... Oh, dwelling? Really?
It says God is the indwelling and not the transient cause of all things.
Oh, mine says.
What does yours say?
God is the immanent, not the transitive cause of all things. So he's.
All things. All right. So here's his proof after Proposition 18. All things which are in God and must be conceived through God. Therefore, God is the cause of those things which are in Him, which is everything. Other besides God, there could be no substance. There's nothing external to God. Blah blah. Indwelling, not the transient. I don't know. I don't really know what the difference between indwelling and transient are in that context. Well, we'll just say that he basically is trying to say that the original cause of all things is God, and restates this a number of times.
Yeah, I mean, that's all I got out of it. I don't know if he's saying anything else here.
Yeah.
He's just using different words, really.
All right. Proposition 19, God and all the attributes of God are eternal, which is to say what we were talking about earlier, that the self-created entity that then reflects all of nature must be eternal because it can't exist in a time environment. Otherwise, it'd be subject to something else.
Puts it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but everything within them has a duration.
Yeah.
Well, not everything.
Because in order for something to have duration, it has to be in an environment that already has durations, and that can't happen for the original self-created entity.
Yeah, it has to have a nature that then causes a duration for it.
Yeah. All right, so 20. The existence of God and his essence are one and the same. So that is to say that because we have entities that exist, this also means God exists, which is kind of like a goofy argument. But basically what it's getting at is that this original self-created entity has to exist by its definition, otherwise we can't exist. And then the things that it contains, which is everything, are also the same thing. So basically, if you were gonna make this into a modern interpretation, you'd say, oh well, basically all Spinoza's saying is that everything is God. And then you tip your bibble and say, oh well, haha, he just believes nature is God. But obviously he a bit more complicated than that.
I'd say so.
Yeah. We're on page 12 after 47 minutes of talking and going very lightly.
Yeah, I'm on 16 on mine, but still.
They're so dense. There's just so much in every frame.
Well, I told you it was a hard read.
Yeah, I didn't take it seriously. My bad. But I mean, to be fair, I think if we covered part 2, we'd be here for like 3 hours. So I think it's good that we're covering only one part right now.
Right, and there's 5 parts because I think part 3 is the long one. That's the long part.
Yeah. All right. Proposition 21. All things which follow from the absolute nature of any attribute of God must always exist and be infinite, or in other words, are eternal and infinite through the said attributes. So this is basically just the transitive property of logic. So if this self-created entity that sprung out of nothing, there was no nothing to spring out of, but it created itself and then had everything within it, so it could contain all possible permutations of reality within it. The self-created entity has all knowledge in it, so all that also includes all knowledge you have, then all reality that you have, and so since that entity,
All thoughts
Yeah.
you've ever thought, God has thought them before you.
yeah, and so since all that is eternal and exists within this entity eternally, then everything else is also eternal. Which I don't know. I guess it's not really relevant. It's like saying it doesn't really mean much to people.
It kind of pertains again a little bit to part 2, and that's the whole thing with the book, is that you can't just pick out a part and read it because it all builds.
Oh yeah,
upon each other.
he's trying to use this metaphysical model to prove it's called, the book is called Ethics, and he's trying to then take this metaphysical model of the self-created single entity, and then use it to derive morality. And whether he succeeds or not, most people disagree that he does, but he makes the attempt. He tries. He throws the football, and it's superb owl day, by the way. America Hand Egg Day that we're reading Spinoza on.
Oh, it's Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I actually used to watch that shit. Yeah, that's way back when I was a teenager, and I don't know. Yeah.
It's not.
That's not.
It's basically a giant advertisement. Don't worry about it.
Oh yeah, it's all brainwashing. And,
All right. Proposition 22. Whatsoever follows from any attribute of God, insofar it is modified by a modification which exists necessarily, and as infinite through the said attribute must exist necessarily, is as infinite. And then, basically, we'll combine 22 and 23. And then 23. Every mode which exists, both necessarily and as infinite, must necessarily follow either from the absolute nature of some attribute of God or from an attribute modified by a modification which exists necessarily and as infinite. So basically what this is saying, not only are all like the original ideas within this original self-created entity, every possible combination and permutation of ideas. So even if you say, oh, well, maybe God, even though if we combine peanut butter and jelly, that wasn't included in God because they're like two separate things that we combined. Well, no, they are combined.
You would have never thought of that.
Yeah, you would have never thought of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches because like they're two separate entities, bro. But no, definitely every permutation of things. So there's nothing that like gets originally created after this entity. Is basically what he's getting at.
So he just still hammers down the same point that everything that is in God.
Yeah.
Or ever was and will be.
All right, so the essence of things produced by God does not involve existence. So he said this earlier, but basically all it means is that none of the existence that stems from the self-created being can be self-created by virtue of how can it be self-created if there's no reference, if there's no thing that can cause it. And so there has to be this original everything reference, which is Spinoza's God. 25. God is the efficient cause not only of the existence of things, but also of their essence. So here he's sort of making the distinction that you cannot say that God isn't causing, say, an evil in the world or something bad to happen because it's part of his essence, it's part of his everything. To say that he's not is sort of just pill pulling. It's being wishy-washy. You're sort of denying the relation between the self-created creator and then you being in existence. You're sort of denying it because it makes you feel bad. And then Spinoza says, "Don't do that. You're being a goof."
This is absurd. Is the word.
He repeatedly says it's absurd to say that this isn't caused by God. Everything's caused by God, you dummy.
That and everyone paying attention to what I'm writing will know that
yeah.
makes sense.
He's like, well, if you just read my proofs, you'll get what I'm getting at, and you're just wrong, bruh. That's what I thought.
Just stupid.
Yeah. So any people tipping their menorahs right now, just go read Spinoza yourself. Like we're just doing a quick summary of it. 26. A thing which is conditioned to act in a particular manner has necessarily been thus conditioned by God, and that which has not been conditioned by God cannot condition itself to act. So that is to say that for the things that cause people to act or move forward or do things or think or do anything or make decisions, act evil, act good, or whatever, they all have to stem from God. There's no other like source they can come from. There's nothing else for it to like to trickle down from.
Yeah.
And so
It's back to the original cause thing.
Yeah.
It's really nothing new. He's just using it.
He's just describing it in this way to sort
effects.
of point out that behavior of
Yeah.
entities cannot be explained by anything but God, which is true if you really take the definition to its limits, which is all Spinoza did. Like, to his credit, like, all he did was he took omnipotence and he took all powerful and he said, okay, well, what does that mean? And he basically, and when he did that, it BTFO'd everybody and made everyone upset. All right. 27. A thing which has been conditioned by God to act in a particular way cannot render itself unconditioned, which is basically just a restatement. So you can't like say, oh, like detach yourself from the causality of the original entity, right? You can't just say, oh, well, I have a new causality now.
Right. Again, all the demonstration is for this one is a restatement of axiom 3, which is from a given determinate cause, the effect follows necessarily, and conversely, if there is no determinate cause, it is impossible for an effect to follow.
So not only can you is nothing acting without the influence of God, you can't actually act without the influence of God, according to Spinoza. But obviously, most theists would be like, well, Spinoza's not talking about God, he's just talking about nature. Anyways.
Well, nature is God, Spinoza would say then.
Yeah. 28. Every individual thing or everything which is finite and has a conditioned existence cannot exist or be conditioned to act unless it be conditioned for existence and action by a cause other than itself, which is also finite, as a conditioned existence, and likewise. This is basically saying, for us finite beings to exist, we must come from a spring well. Something must have created the environment for us to exist in. And you can see this if you try to do like stoner metaphysical models, like, oh, we're on top of a giant turtle, brah, or we're in the eye of a giant, or we're like a snowflake, or whatever the heck. You got to keep explaining, and you just keep going, and eventually you hit, all right, well, there's an entity that contains everything, like, and then shut the book, and that's basically it. That's where you end up. And that entity also has to be self-created and also contain all knowledge. So Spinoza makes sort of a compelling argument metaphysically that there is this sort of self-created God entity.
Yeah, the only line I have underlined in the demonstration of this is, for there is nothing except substance and its modes. It again, because in this part he also still tries to wrap up everything. Yeah, I don't even know how to explain it.
All right. That was what? That was 27. And 28 we just talked about, and 29. Nothing in the universe is contingent, but all things are conditioned to exist and operate in a particular manner by the necessity of the divine nature. So it's just another restatement that basically everything is conditioned from that original cause that contains all possible permutations of existence, of knowledge, of conception. And without that spring well, you can't exist. Reading it again, I guess it is a lot of restatement. It was just kind of really dense. I didn't see it originally.
It's the same thing over and over again, to a large extent. But again, it's him attacking the argument from many different angles. So it is when you're reading it closely with all the demonstrations and scholariums and corollaries, it doesn't read like the same thing because he goes into such detail every time, like a lot of detail. Too much, I would say.
Yeah, it kind of overdoes it sometimes. Proposition 30, intellect in function, finite or in function infinite, must comprehend the attributes of God and the modifications of God and nothing else. This is to say, you cannot have an original idea because the original self-created entity already had that idea. You're basically just the only ideas you have are just from a subset of the original self-created entity, which makes sense. That in order for your thoughts to exist, they must have a source somewhere that's able to cause them, and they can't just be like original. Like every permutation of the environment has to be hard baked into the original entity. Is kind of what he's getting at, and that makes sense from a very sort of materialistic standpoint. That you can't have, and just a logical standpoint. That how could something exist if it didn't previously exist? And then how can you be sure that there isn't something causing something else unless it contains everything? That's basically just a very simple logic Spinoza uses, and he does it pretty well. All right. 31. The intellect in function, whether finite or infinite, as will, desire, love, should be referred to passive nature and not active nature. So this is talking about sort of a different distinction of his time between, I forget what the exact wording is, like nature, natura, and
natura, naturans.
Yeah,
naturans.
so he's saying nature, nature instead of nature, nurture, which is kind of funny. I don't know.
Now that you say it like that, yeah, that's kind of funny.
Yeah. And so he
means glossed over that because when he used those terms, it was like, oh no, I can't be bothered.
Yeah, they're kind of right old, specific terms to the early philosophy of his time. All right, through some attribute of God, which expresses the eternal infinite. So yeah, basically all he's just restating that no matter, even if your thoughts are different, they're like feelings, or like, oh, they're like desires or whatever, then they're contained and within this infinite subset that's self-created and is able to project the environment. All right, so 32. Will cannot be called a free cause, but only a necessary cause. So yeah, even though
that's back to substance being the only thing with the free of cause.
Yeah, so the ability to have will in the environment is caused by the environment, and then the permutations of the will are also within that original reflection. But and now Chow might be saying, oh well, yeah, I got you, Jeff. Now you're a base determinist. No, Chow. So the difference here is that if we live in Spinoza's world, if Spinoza's God, who has done everything and will do everything, there is actually functionally no way we can tell which permutation we are in, and the permutations are infinite. And although they may be in the existence of knowledge of this entity, it's basically, it just keeps going. It's eternal. There's no way to determine where we're at. But if you have the Christian God, which is what causes problems, then there's one universe, there's one way, everything will happen, and this is set in stone, there's nothing else. There's only one way. But with Spinoza's God, there's sort of unbounded, you're in an unbounded supermutation of every permutation of every conceivable reality. And so there's no way you could ever tell why you're acting, and so, or how you're acting, or which permutation you're in.
Infinity into the mix, which kind of destroys determinism.
Yeah, like
infinity does exist mathematically.
And he talks about this later. Like, we'll never be able to really get to the root cause of everything, and so if we can't explain it, then functionally we're free. And if nothing can really ever explain it, and according to Spinoza's model, I don't think there's always the possibility until you reach that endpoint that it can't be explained.
You can get closer to it, but you won't get, because one of the earlier proposals was that, or was it, the more attributes you assign to something, the more real it gets, but there's an infinite amount of attributes to be assigned to the thing.
And so well, my standard for determinism is, can it be predicted? And I say no. And this is true under Spinoza's model, that at least for our, no matter what, unless you are that entity, unless you're actual Spinoza's God, you can't actually know why you're doing something. You won't have the full picture. And since we can never get the full picture, we can never be sure. And since we can never be sure, we can never be determined. Pretty simple. All right.
Determinism, BTF.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Proposition 33. Things cannot have been brought into being by God in any manner or in any order which is different from that which has in fact obtained. So this is sort of Spinoza saying that the entity of this self-created God cannot choose. It can't choose an order for things to be in. It just sort of spring wells from it. It just reflects and it creates, and it doesn't make choices. He's already done everything, and he already will do everything. It's not like he sees,
which kind of goes straightly against the Christian belief as well.
Well, yeah, the Jewish belief too, which is why he got hilariously excommunicated in the intro.
Because God willed, he created the world and it was good, or whatever is in Genesis. And that's not what happened, according to
Spinoza's
Spinoza.
God was just universe. He said it was self-caused and he had no cause. He was just a pantheist.
Yeah.
Well, Chow, but the interesting thing is that you can't just say, oh, well, it's the material universe, because he also includes thought. So there's this extra, pantheism has problems with it. Yeah, it does. But there's this extra layer that that includes also abstract thought and then permutations of things. And so there's this sort of...
There's non-material things in this explanation.
Yeah. So
Fine.
also everything imaginable.
Non-materialistic view.
Everything imaginable must be able to be made by Spinoza's God and have been made by Spinoza's God. And Spinoza's God is just basically unrestrained omnipotence, unrestrained omniscience. Stumbled on my words there for a sec. And if you just unrestrain them, then yeah, it's an infinite, never-ending supermutation where everything can be done, has been done, will be done. And you cannot say that God hasn't done something. You just can't do that. Like try saying that. Does it make any sense? Yeah, but it doesn't seem to justify it. Oh, why? Well, Chow, I think we talked about this before you got here, but it's basically
Read the book.
Read the RTB.
Try to read the book, I would say.
RTFB. He justifies it by saying that, all right, how can your thoughts exist if there isn't a original entity that contained those thoughts so they could exist? Like, so Chow, how could your thoughts exist if the original entity that created the meta environment doesn't contain them? I don't think they can.
He says he has read it.
Things could not have been brought to God by manner. All right, so that's 33.
34.
34. God's power is identical with his essence. And so this is just another thing he said that sort of reiterates that point that God's essence contains everything, and so God's power is everything, and so he's made everything, and he's also not made everything. So every permutation of existence and non-existence he has made because it's in his power, and it's the same as his being. Spinoza, that I've read it, but Spinoza, that sounds like a monotheistic worldview and not a pantheist. Well, here's the thing: is that it is monotheistic in a sense, Chow, because like Spinoza's God is modally singular, but within that entity contains everything else that as Spinoza would call them,
everything else.
Spinoza would call all the basic bitch, like human personality, making choices and decisions like a person, gods, would be contained within that. So like anything that like humans conceive as gods would also exist. Even though, like, according to Spinoza, they wouldn't really be gods. They'd just be like entities contained within the sort of meta self-creator. All right. 35. Whatsoever we conceive to be in the power of God necessarily exists. So, like, yeah, like, once again, like what I've been reiterating, you cannot say God hasn't done something. Otherwise, you're restricting his power. You're restricting his power a fair bit. And if you say God has not done something, then he is contained in a subset of the God who has done something.
Because it has been done.
Because you could say that a God who does one thing, even if he has all the same attributes as the original God, or Spinoza's God, then he is lesser than the God who has done everything, because he has more attributes, as Spinoza put it. He has more to him. He's more reality. And not only has he more reality, but he has more power because he's demonstrably made more things and not like made choices. He's done everything. So that's what true power is. You seem to be a bit fuzzy on Spinoza. Yeah, like it is a rough read, and we're only doing part one. It's already been like an hour, and we're almost not even done with part one.
Oh yeah. I have to go soon, so we have to.
All right, shit. Okay. 36. There is no cause from whose nature some effect does not follow. So it's basically saying there's no effectless cause. You can't call something a cause without effect. And this is just sort of wrapping up the point that our existence is an effect, and it has to have a cause. And there's an original cause, and that original cause must be self-created. It must contain everything, all existence, and all knowledge, and it must be able to put them into being. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here because like individual things don't have the ability to self-create. Okay. My doggo's barking. Activate doggo. Ruff, ruff.
So what do you want to say about this? Now we're at the appendix, which is
Okay.
the first part. Yeah.
The appendix, he also talks a shit ton of... He talks a bunch of smack to everybody. And he says, basically, that people who say God has a personality, or he makes decisions, or he has a goal, or that he's like, let's say God's doing something because he wants to do X, Y, or Z. Well, that's kind of stupid, because God's already done everything, and he already will do everything. And he doesn't have to make decisions. He's not he's not so lowly. He has to make decisions within an environment, within a time frame.
He doesn't have a goal to strive to.
Yeah, if God is striving for a goal, then that goal must be external to him, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't be striving for a goal. That doesn't make any sense. It's nonsensical.
It's absurd.
It's absurd, as Spinoza would write in his book. And then he sort of says that basically humans, they understood that they were created, but then they applied all their goofy biases to God. So like, well, God must also agree that earthquakes are bad because yeah, we hate earthquakes. Or well, these things that in the wheat that we like is like good because God is good too. So basically, it's making a very simplistic attribution of a thing I like and thing I don't like to God, which Spinoza says is stupid, to say the least.
To say the very least.
Say at the very least.
I'm getting distracted by the doggos.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll wrap it up here. Basically, I like Spinoza.
I don't remember much else from the appendix, other than basically that being drawn out.
Yeah, he's basically just fedora tipping in the entire appendix, which is funny. I like Spinoza. I kind of agree with his model. I agree that I wouldn't. I think calling it God is just being like it's being a memer. You're basically just like dabbing on other people. Well, I mean, probably not. I guess not, actually.
There's probably not. I don't know how widespread atheism was back then, but I mean, insofar as people tried to create a worldview with a God in it, it makes sense that he kind of just put this whole body of theory on that pedestal of God. Because that's the thing to do.
Yeah, maybe, but Chow, you could say, Chow says, yeah, but you could say that about Spinoza's God as well, looking how he lived, and he also had biases for his God being the way he describes him. Well, certainly, yeah, Spinoza the man has biases, but sort of the model of the God he describes is unbiased. Like, there's no way it can be biased.
So too. It seems very neutral. I mean, we haven't read the rest of it. I don't know how far you got into it, but
yeah. And you're right. He's a product of his time. But the sort of the idea that everything that exists must have an original cause, and that original cause, in order not to be subsumed, and this is what no person is unbiased. Of course not. But I'm saying his model is unbiased because this is what he presents. He presents a model, and I agree with his model.
Keeping bias out of his model.
Because physical metaphysics is all about onion layers, right? You could always have another layer of metaphysics. You can always say, okay, so we're in the Christian God, and then we'll all go to heaven or whatever. But then the Christian God is like living on top of a turtle inside like Zeus's armpit, so on and so forth, until you just get to like infinite layers of reality that you can never be sure. And Spinoza puts an end to this. He says, well, obviously everything that exists and everything that can be conceived is part of this self-created singular entity that sits on the outside of all onions. The ultimate onion, if you will.
Shrek philosophy. Yeah.
Shrek philosophy, yeah. Maybe I should start referring to it when I talk about onion realities. But I mean, it's just a simple, understandable
background
concept. So Spinoza ends the onion, and I was thinking about this for a while about like, well, how do we know the end of the onion? And Spinoza does it. He says that everything that is, can be, and can be thought of, exists within the self-created entity. Otherwise, it can't exist. It can be conceived, or it wouldn't exist. And that makes sense.
It's a nice logical conclusion.
It's a logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And you can't really it's much harder to come up with like an alternative explanation for like, okay, so why did the universe just like popped out of nothing? It was in this environment. Well, it created the meta environment the universe popped out of. Like, you know, it doesn't explain anything. And Spinoza sort of explains it by taking the God concept to its logical conclusion, which upset all the theists who want to make God into their sky daddy and have him like make all these decisions and hate these things that they think are bad and like these things that they think are good, which is so like, it's so demeaning, right? Like why would you think this?
Not exactly, because you said this in an earlier review we did that religion is kind of politics.
Well, yes.
In a nutshell, and you kind of for a framework to be applicable to the masses in a way that makes them productive and not kill each other.
Well, yeah. I mean, sure, as terms of a way of conducting society.
We don't know
sure.
of his moralities the morality he derives yet.
But
we haven't read it.
We haven't even gotten to that part yet. Well, and maybe that will reveal Spinoza to not be a based boy. We'll see.
But at the very least, not to be something that's pragmatic.
What I'm talking about is sort of the truth value. I'm talking about the truth value.
Yeah, the truth value, yeah. But on the pragmatic and utilitarian,
the ability of the theistic model to describe reality pales in comparison to the Spinozan model. Like it just gets cucked. It just gets crapped on. And I challenge any theist who, of which I know I have a lot of theist watchers, and they watch my battles and my fedora tipping and my arguments, and they're interested in that sort of thing. Just read Spinoza's Part 1. It's like 20 dense pages. Just give it a shot and see if your ideas stand up to it. That's all you got to do. Don't take my word for it. I've just been reading a summary, basically.
Yeah, I'm my next step after this one on the theism aspect is because from what I've heard from lectures, this does not go completely out of line with Orthodox Christianity. With the whole,
there are Christian sects who sort of try to integrate Spinoza successfully or unsuccessfully. They got all
that essence energy distinction and identity over time philosophy that I haven't gone into. So
yeah. I don't know. Yeah. I'd have to read up more on it. I mean, like, I'm no Spinoza scholar. I've just read Part 1. I've read one essay, which is in the description, that talks a bit about some the more finer details in modern philosophy relating to Spinoza, and that's it. But I think it's a pretty elegant explanation for the onion problem. Like
we both want to finish this,
and we're eventually going to finish this eventually. Yeah. But the for the problem of like, when does the onion layer of reality end? Well, Spinoza figured that out, and I think that's pretty great. That's a pretty good accomplishment.
Yep.
And before we go, I'll answer Chow's question. How do you come to know capital T truth in the Spinoza model? Or is this pragmatism? I think the truth still remains a practical practice rather than a knowable practice. Because once again, you can't know what onion layer you are on in the Spinoza model, and so there could always be like a different cause that you can't understand. Spinoza admits this later in the book. He talks about how like we can never really, we probably can never have complete causal knowledge with our human minds. Or if didn't integrate Spinoza.
They didn't integrate it. That's not what I meant. If I said that, I misspoke. But never mind. I don't know too much about it anyway, so he's fair to call me a dummy. I'll take that. I'll take that lying down.
What value is true? Well, I mean, just like what is observable that we observe in the day-to-day, and then we expect not to change on the next day. Because basically, that's always been my sort of pragmatic truth value, and it's certainly still in flux under the Spinozan model. But at least I now know that there's an end to the onion layers we may or may not be living in. We could be living in a giant's eye, in a snowflake, in a computer simulation, in a whatever. But at least I know at the very end of it, there's this entity that is all things that has to reflect inwards. Otherwise, things couldn't really exist, and that thing also has to be self-created. So I think Spinoza did a good job. And we'll go back to this book later once Mo gets some more time. I don't know if we're gonna have a next episode. I'll try to wrangle one up. And yeah.
Right.
Might need to get on a stream one day to explain some props of this Fedora worldview. Yeah, no worries, Chow. If you ever want to pick up your mic and BTFO
I was about to say that, Chow, you should have been here for this one. You seem way more insightful on the subject, so why aren't you talking?
Well, yeah, you're right. I know, Chow, I already know what you're aiming at. I know my pragmatic truth view doesn't have universals, and then you can just like fedora tip me and say, oh well, you can't say anything is true. What does true even mean? Haha, cucked. But you know what I mean. You know what I'm getting at. I think in terms of this like practical advice for living or using it in day-to-day life, it works, which is good enough for me. And I've always found that philosophy, outside of trying to figure out the truth of things, is for using as advice in life. And I don't think Spinoza, well, maybe when we get into the ethics, he'll maybe have some of that. But in the metaphysics was more just a metaphysics discussion. Pragmatic views also have holes. Well, yeah. And yeah, I agree. All right, yeah, thanks for tuning in. We'll cover the rest of Spinoza's ethics at a later time. And yeah, it was fun.
Oh, yeah. Peace out.